Cape Canaveral Launch Complex 36, LC-36. Launch Complex 36, LC-36, is a launch complex located at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, CCSFS, in Florida. Located south of the Missile Row launch range, the complex originally consisted of two pads, designated Launch Complex 36A, LC-36A, and Launch Complex 36B, LC-36B, to support the flights of Atlas expendable launch vehicles equipped with a Centaur upper stage. Missile Row was a nickname given in the 1960s to the 8SM-65 Atlas and HGM-25A Titan I launch complexes at the middle area of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, historically used by the United States Air Force, USAF, and NASA, namely Launch Complex 11, LC-11, to Launch Complex 16, LC-16, as well as Launch Complex 19, LC-19, and Launch Complex 20, LC-20. Operated by the 45th Space Wing since 1949, it was the site of all 14 Mercury Atlas and Gemini launches, as well as many other early missile tests, Department of Defense, DoD, launches, and NASA launches. Missile Row and Cape Canaveral played a secondary role to Vandenberg Air Force Base, now Space Force Base, in California for Department of Defense launches, but it was used by many NASA launches of unmanned space probes, thanks to said spacecraft being typically launched on military vehicles. From the 1960s to the 1980s, LC-36 was used by NASA and the United States Air Force, USAF, to launch many payloads from the Atlas Centaur rocket and its derivatives, including the Pioneer, Surveyor, and Mariner probes. During the late 1980s, LC-36B was also used to launch the Atlas G, and General Dynamics, and later Lockheed Martin, modified the two pads to support the larger Atlas I, Atlas II, and Atlas III throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Following the Atlas program's relocation to Space Launch Complex 41, SLC-41, in 2005, LC-36 stood vacant until Blue Origin acquired the lease in 2015 for use by their heavy-lift New Glenn rocket. The company made extensive modifications to the complex during this time, including demolishing LC-36A and LC-36B to build one large pad in place, as well as integrating the neighboring Launch Complex 11, LC-11, into the facility. Following this large-scale renovation, the new era of LC-36 commenced with the maiden flight of New Glenn on January 16, 2025. LC-36 was originally constructed by the United States government in the early 1960s in order to launch the Atlas Centaur rocket, with first launch on May 8, 1962. LC-36A was the scene of the biggest on-pad explosion in Cape history when Atlas Centaur AC-5 fell back onto the pad on March 2, 1965. The accident spurred NASA to complete work on LC-36B, which had been abandoned when it was 90% finished. LC-36B was built near LC-36A, due to the Atlas Centaur's increasing flight rate, and low reliability early on. The LC-36B pad was modified by the operator of Atlas during the late 1980s to be able to launch the Atlas I, with first launch occurring on July 25, 1990, and was subsequently modified two additional times during the 1990s to launch the Atlas II and Atlas III launch vehicles. Atlas III made its sixth and final launch from LC-36B on February 3, 2005. There was a total of 69 and 76 launches from pads LC-36A and LC-36B, respectively, while the United States government operated the launch complex in the first 5 decades of spaceflight. The LC-36 pad was in use from mid-2005 through 2015. The legacy Atlas Centaur umbilical towers of both pads were demolished in 2006. The mobile service towers were both demolished in controlled explosions on June 16, 2007. Tower B was demolished at 13:59 Greenwich Mean Time, 9:59 Eastern Daylight Time, and Tower A followed 12 minutes later, at 14:11 Greenwich Mean Time, 10:11 Eastern Daylight Time. In 2008, Aviation Week magazine reported that the United States Air Force committed to lease Launch Complex 36 to Space Florida for future use by the Athena 3 launch system, but that program never moved forward. In March 2010, the USAF 45th Space Wing issued real property licenses to Space Florida for Space Launch Complexes 36 and 46 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Moon Express leased the pad in February 2015 from Space Florida as a development and test site for its commercial lunar operations and its lunar lander flight test vehicles. In 2015, Blue Origin signed a long-term lease of launch site from Space Florida for launching Blue's orbital rockets, after Space Florida had previously leased the facility from the USAF in 2010 in order to facilitate commercial use of the land and facilities since the Air Force no longer required use of the launch complex. Moon Express and Blue Origin shared LC-36, delineated into LC-36A and LC-36B respectively, until Moon Express announced its relocation to Launch Complexes 17 and 18 in 2016, allowing Blue Origin full use of the LC-36 facility. In early 2016, Blue intended to begin orbital launches by 2020, as of 2019 they are expected to begin from LC-36 no earlier than 2024, although the launch finally occurred on January 16, 2025. On September 15, 2015, Blue Origin announced it would use Launch Complex 36 for launches of its orbital launch vehicle later in the decade. Blue had the lease in place for Launch Complex 36 by late 2015 from the Florida State Space Agency, Space Florida, and will manufacture their new B-4 powered orbital launch vehicle at the nearby Exploration Park, also a part of the Space Florida Land Complex. Exploration Park is a partnership formed in 2011 between NASA's Kennedy Space Center, KSC, and Space Florida Agency. There are 121 hectares, 299 acres, on KSC property, but outside the NASA badge-controlled area. As of March 2016, companies have the opportunity to lease office or research facilities, or build their own facilities. The Exploration Park is aimed at research and development, office, and light manufacturing commercial activities. The leased land and agreement with Space Florida is a part of the NASA's efforts to grow and deploy commercial space capabilities. By October 2015, the pad design and configuration were not yet publicly known. Blue Origin broke ground for the facility to initiate construction activity on the site in June 2016. By March 2016, the first launch of the Blue Orbital Launch Vehicle New Glenn was estimated to be no earlier than 2020, and that target date had not changed by the time high-level specifications for the new launcher were unveiled in September 2016, nor by the time construction of the launch site was well underway in September 2018. New Glenn is a very large 7-meter, 23-foot, diameter vehicle. The first stage is powered by 7 B-4 methane-oxygen engines producing 17.1 meganewtons, 3,850,000 pounds force, total thrust at launch. The first stage is reusable and designed for vertical landing. Blue Origin has also leased the adjacent land, formerly known as Launch Complex 11, LC-11, to use as a ground-based rocket engine test facility. Construction of the new launch complex and engine test facility was still underway in September 2018. In addition to LC-11, Blue Origin also leased Launch Complex 12, LC-12, to the north, which has been in use as a storage site for various hardware surrounding New Glenn heavy-lift launch vehicle. Although Blue Origin has been publicly quiet about the status of the launch complex construction, high-resolution aerial photography released after Hurricane Dorian in September 2019 showed that facility foundation work is in place, including for the horizontal integration facility, the launch service structure, lightning tower, and water tower, and above-ground steel construction has commenced. In September 2019, the propellant tank farm was in the process of being installed.